Hello? 1, 2. Check, check. Welcome. It's not loud though. Hello.
Hello, good evening. I'm Lyda DeBin. I'm the executive director here at the Center for Fiction. Are some of you joining us for the first time? Can I see a show of hands? If so, wonderful. Welcome. So, the Center for Fiction is a 200-year-old arts nonprofit. Our mission is to encourage people to read and value fiction and to support and celebrate its creation and enjoyment. We do this through public events, reading groups, writing workshops, all offering vibrant, accessible, and inclusive programs that welcome a wide community to the joy of story. Our Kids Read program offers immersive reading experiences for children, and we support early career writers with our first novel prize and our Emerging Writer Fellowship. So visit our site, sign up for the mailing list, follow us on social media, and if you like what you see, become a member so you're tuned into all the activities and come back and see us soon. For example, next Wednesday, October the 16th, New York Times best-selling author Attica Locke is visiting the center to celebrate the release of her new novel, Guide Me Home, the culmination of her award-winning Highway 59 trilogy that includes Bluebird, Bluebird, and Heaven, My Home. All right, for tonight, some logistics. After the talk, we'll have an audience Q&A. So if you're here in the room, please raise your hand and one of our wonderful interns will bring you a mic. Please do use the mic so that guests on our live stream can hear you ask your question. And then for those of you joining on the live stream, add your questions to the chat and we'll read from those before we break for the signing line. Brea was kind enough to pre-sign your books for tonight's event, and we'll be doing a personalization line after the event just on the other side of that wall. So I'll come back on and share some instructions for that after the conversation. And for the main event. Tonight's event is part of our On America series, which brings writers, journalists, activists, and change makers together to reflect on the critical issues of our times. This program was funded in part by Humanities New York with support from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Any views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this conversation do not necessarily represent those of the National Endowment for the Humanities. We are so grateful for their support. Thank you as well to our program partners, Where's My Land, a reparations organization that leverages advocacy, technology, and research to help Black victims of land theft secure restitution, and our authors. Tonight, we are thrilled to host Brea Baker to talk about her book, Rooted, The American Legacy of Land Theft and the Modern Movement for Black Land Ownership. Joining her in conversation is scholar Amy Godine, author of The Black Woods. Please join me in welcoming our authors on stage. We're turning our mic on. So,
All right.
we're gonna go again.
Thank you.
Sorry about the technical difficulties,
Yes.
y'all.
Hi.
Hey, I'm so excited.
I am too. I have to get out my little notes. This is a real honor to be here. It's my first time. Is it your first time here?
Yeah.
It's
yeah.
pretty splendid, isn't it?
Oh, it's gorgeous. The
grand.
space is beautiful. So thank y'all for
Yeah.
being with us in it.
Yeah, and it's an honor to have read your book. It was really a treat. I'm grateful and shaken and moved by the news it brings, and I am in awe of your ability to marshal as many facts and points of proof that you did to make your case. And I guess my first thought was this book is compelled by such a sense of urgency, such a sense of action now. It just is a call to action. It feels compelled. It feels like a book that needed to be written, that you felt tapped to write this. And I wondered if there was an event or a person or a memory or something in your life that triggered the whole process, if there's something that got you launched on this, because it really is propulsive.
Thank you so much for saying that. And yes, definitely. There were a series of moments that sort of led me to writing this book. The first was the death of my paternal grandfather. And prior to that point, I had already been an activist and doing a lot of racial justice work, but I'd been doing that almost exclusively through the lens of policing and criminal justice system. And I'm still very passionate about addressing racist policing and mass incarceration. And there is a really robust conversation around racial justice that we're not having. And this idea that one or two interventions can like solve racism is something that people are holding on to. And it was something about my grandfather's death that made me realize that. On his deathbed, he shared with my aunt, one of his last words was, "Don't sell the land." And that felt like a crystal clear clarion call of what he wanted us to do. And so my work really started as just a personal project. I wanted to piece together why the land meant so much to him, to share that with my family, with my siblings, with my cousins, so that we as that next generation would take on that baton with a sense of urgency. And what I didn't realize was that the information I was going to uncover about my own family would push me to learn more about the fact that we are just one of many Black families in this country who have this experience of land theft in our line, but more so that the longer we avoid that part of the problem, it's going to only compound and get worse. And that was something that I really became clear on. And I had felt that in my policing work, was this idea that we were in like a revolving door and we were just never getting out of it, and I couldn't understand why. And we were just doing a lot of Band-Aid, interventions, and they were not getting at the source. And ultimately, what I found through that research was that at the source of most of the injustices that Black Americans are experiencing today is land theft and the ramifications of land theft. So my grandfather passed away in 2019. So I'm doing all this personal research for my grandfather and about my grandfather with my grandmother. And in 2021, two other things happened. Number one, I get married on that land. And it felt like a good culmination of all of the personal research I was doing was for my wife and I to, edify our love on that land. And so that made the land even more special to me. It wasn't just this relic that my grandfather cared a lot about. It was this site of our ongoing love. And 2021 was also the centennial anniversary of the Tulsa Massacre. So land is just top of mind for me in every way. It's a site of love, it's a site of generational wealth, but it's also a site of pain and trauma. And I was feeling as though there was a need to put all of that together. And I thought it was gonna be an article, and every time I tried to write it, it got longer and longer and longer.
I know something about that. Yeah, I started
And I said,
with
maybe this is a book.
article too. It happens. They explode on you.
Yeah.
Well done. For an article, it turned into a pretty
Pretty sick one, huh?
impressive book with a massive of quoted scholarly information that really floats many of your contentions and shows how much more deeply we can go if we want to and dig deeper into those resources, which I was very grateful for. But you start with the personal, you start with your family, and that makes you branch out. Was your family on board with that widening all the way? Did some of them think you're going too far, let's keep it here? Or do they all root for you to go out into the big picture approach to this? I'm curious about that.
Yeah, that's a good question.
Maybe,
I
don't
think
know.
with a lot, no, it really is a good question. I think with a lot of my family members, to be honest, they didn't know what I was really doing until it started to take a shape.
Yeah.
I was just getting on Zoom with people and driving down to North Carolina, having conversations. And it was just like, Brea's up to something. I mean, she's writing something, she's researching something, and my grandmother's name is Janelle, and especially with my elders in our family, she was sort of my proxy. When I wanted to sit down with someone, she'd be like, well, my granddaughter wants to talk to you.
Yeah.
And then it was like, well, Janelle let me in the room, and they didn't really care what I was doing after they got the cosign from my grandmother. But I will say that with my grandmother, she was my research partner, my source, my inspiration in this way, because my grandfather, there were so many times writing this book where I wished he was alive and I could have interviewed him.
Yeah.
But she was that living connection, and her connection was different. My paternal grandfather came from a landed Black family. His father had land, and his grandfather had land, and his great-grandfather had land, and his great-great-grandfather had land, which is not something that a lot of Black people can say.
Yeah.
And my grandmother could not say that. She was a sharecropper. She was born a sharecropper, was the child and grandchild of sharecroppers, and had never experienced land ownership until she got married to him. And so she helped me to widen the lens, because when I started the book, I was actually almost exclusively thinking financially. I was thinking in the sense of land has been taken from Black people. That land has a dollar amount attached to it. So when people are like, reparations is too hard, I think it's actually very easy. We evaluate and assess the land values all the time, and we can account for that. So to me, I just felt like I wanted to say that in instances like a Tulsa, in instances like a Wilmington massacre, in instances like eminent domain, there is a dollar amount that we can attach to the theft and to the loss. That's what the book started for me. But then I would sit with my grandmother and I'd talk to her about land, and I'd say, you know, land is a vehicle for economics, and you know, you could be selling licenses to people who want to hunt on your land. And then she'd sit me down and be like, Brea, I don't own the deer. Why would I sell a license for someone else to hunt deer on our land as if I have a monopoly on the deer? If someone near us wants to hunt, they can hunt. And I'll just tell them to tell me so I can be inside and not be in the way.
Wow.
And that was one of the lighter ways that she had brought it up. But there were so many ways that I'd ask her a question trying to get at the dollar amount at the core of something.
Yeah.
And she would answer in a way that had nothing to do with money.
Yeah.
She'd answer in a way that was, you know, when I'd ask her what land did for her, she almost never talked about money or economic stability. She talked about the confidence it gave her as a Black girl from southern North Carolina, right on the border of South Carolina, where even now, my grandmother, the last time that she was in her hometown prior to us doing this research was in 2006. She went back for a funeral, and the funeral home had segregated parking.
Yeah.
Like, there are parts of the South that are still that. And I could see her change when she was in those parts of the South where it reminded her of what it meant to be a sharecropper versus what it meant to be a landowner. And it was nothing about money. It was about what it meant to feel you deserved to be in a space, to take up space, to pick fresh food and not have that be marketed to you as 3 times the price of whatever else you were gonna buy. Like, she would bring up things that talked about like food security and emotional wellness and things that I was not checking for at all. I really wanted, and still the call to action from the book is reparations, but now my lens is that reparations is about a lot more than money. I mean, it is also about money. It is also about money, but
You're very conscious of the monetary value of land and the power it gives through its value. And that's maybe a difference between your perspective and hers. You bring that pragmatism and that hard sense of what hard sense means in this case. And I think you make that point over and again, talking about generational wealth, what was stripped away because of legislation going back 200 years, and how it adds up so extraordinarily. That just comes through in chapter after chapter. As well, I want to point out, as Brea's emphasis on the tie between the indigenous experience and the Black American experience as far as land theft goes. It's a straight through line in the book. You don't just visit it in the first chapter and then abandon it for the rest of the book. You track it all the way through, which is a real gift. Because I think so many writers will just marginalize one or the other in the course of this book. And this book really integrates them, which is a gift. I remember you're describing your grandmother. I think your grandmother first being shown the land by her beau, and discovering that the family owned 500 acres.
yes.
That's a lot of land.
It is
And
a
she was
lot.
like, as you put it, whoa. It was a whoa moment for
Yes.
her. Yeah.
Truly, because she described that, again, from her experience as a sharecropping family, she had never known Black people to own anything.
Yeah.
Land, property, a business, a tractor, nothing. Every Black person she knew rented the tools that they used to work the land from the same people who were their landlords and their employers. Like the white people that cut your check were also, you know, in charge of your housing and your health care and so many other things. And she had never known autonomy the way that they had it. She had never known all of this and just everywhere you look is just more Baker acres, and that it's just houses that other bakers live in. And she had not known that. And again, that I think that goes to, there was a beautiful lesson she learned about the economic stability, because she didn't marry into a wealthy family. She married into a landed working class Black family that worked their own land. That, you know, my grandfather was one of 17, so she had a lot of, you know, brothers and sisters-in-laws to meet. So she related to them in that way. But the thing that was different was how they carried themselves, how sure of themselves they were, how they knew that no matter what else happened, they had a safety net, which was this land. And that was something that even, you know, when we were doing the research for this book and I would talk to her about it, and she was just like, yeah, it's so special to be on something and to know no one can snatch it from you. And I think that reveals that it is about the money, but the equity is more about the security that comes with knowing that no one can take your dream from you. And what she didn't realize when she married into that family is that it could still be taken. Right. That even when you do have it, it can still be taken. Yeah. And the 500-acre farm that she married into has dwindled down to each of the siblings has about 5 to 6 acres left. Yeah. And my grandfather spent his pension buying back 92 more acres because he could not believe how much had been lost in his lifetime.
And some of the heirs are still ambivalent about whether they want to keep it or not. So there's a continual debate or discussion in the family about keep it. No, I want to give it up. I need the money and so forth. So that's an ongoing friction that maybe represents what happens nationally.
Right, and that friction is a byproduct of a lot of property law incentivizes a very territorial, mine, yours mentality with land, versus Black and Indigenous people have historically always held land very communally, very, you know, even within my family. My great-great-great-grandfather is the first Black person in my family to own land, and he bought it with his wife and kids and deeded it to his, you know, and passed it on, and it was always meant to be shared. And even outside of that land that he bought with his family, he was also a founding member of a church, put up some of his own dollars for land that now is Greater Lovely Baptist Church and still stands in North Carolina. And that wasn't a place where he was ever going to live or where he'd be able to sell it one day. He knew buying it that this is something that I will never get the typical ROI, return on investment, for. But the return on investment is that my community needs a church and a church needs land. And my community needs a school and school needs land. And the idea that Black people would treat land in such a communal way that what do we need? How can my land fuel what we need? Is now very difficult to do, and heirs property laws makes it so difficult to do. And so that was actually part of why my grandfather, he kind of saw that the land that he held with his siblings was heirs property laws, and he kind of needed to start fresh. And he was like, I need a new clean slate to start where I can pass it on to my children and my grandchildren, not as heirs property land, but as a trust, which is how you can protect it more. But inherently, that requires it to be more individualistic, you know, and so.
What's your relationship to the land today? Are you a seasonal resident of it? Is it a place you go to relax and replenish your spirit? Are you farming there?
Do you, the North Carolina land or the general sense of land?
No, the North Carolina land. Then we can get to the general, but let's stick with the family first.
Yeah. So with the family land, definitely seasonal. My sister's here in the first row. We visit several times a year, whether that's for Thanksgiving, birthdays, you know, unfortunately funerals, and sometimes, you know, weddings, and depending on what the year is, there will be more. But her son is 2, my son is 1. They've both been down several times a year in their lifetimes already, and that's the tradition that we want to keep going for them. So it is a place it's a place we commune together in. And the people living on that land are my aunt and cousin. And the rest of us sort of, it's like our homegoing. We descend upon it, we do our fish fries, we do our barbecues, we throw up the, you know, fireworks and do the things that we do on that land together. But the North Carolina land did inspire me to not be seasonal about land and my connection to it when I'm not on that land. So I live in Georgia now, and I do have an acre there, which is much smaller than what we have in North Carolina, but it's just enough for us. We have 8 chickens and raised garden beds and all sorts of things that I never imagined growing up in Long Island.
In Atlanta, yeah. Well done. Yeah. In your book, you make a case throughout, and it feels like this is at the heart of the book, for recognizing land justice and land return as an essential cause no less than any other. In fact, maybe the primary cause, and deserving of reparations maybe more than any other. That's a big claim. Do you want to talk about that, about your sense of mission here, defending this cause in particular in the Black freedom struggle, and why you think the deprivation of land justice contributed to, more than anything else, maybe more than slavery, to racial inequality in this?
1,000,000%.
Yeah.
Well, I think that slavery and land theft go hand in hand. It is impossible to have one conversation without the other, which is, I appreciate you saying earlier that the history of Indigenous people's relationship to land was threaded throughout, because I could not just have a side chapter like, and this is what Indigenous people were doing that whole time. It just felt like at every point in American history, Black and Native people have been trying to find our place in this economy and in this land. Sometimes that has been the same exact conversation because historically our economy has been agriculture. So let me start there. As far as why I believe that addressing land theft is so critical to the things that we're addressing today is, number one, because the wealth that Black people deserved a slice of was built on the backs of the work we did on this land. And so it maybe would be a different conversation if the economy was, I don't know, if everyone was like making robots at the time, but like the economy was what we did with the land, what we could yield from it, what we could ship north and internationally to be, manipulated in factories and turned into other products. And I think that's really important that we not lose sight of that. Up until very recently, like we are not yet in a place, we have not in this country spent even 100 years where our economy has been non-agrarian. Like most of American history, our wealth, the richest country in the world, has been made on agriculture. So if during those times, Black people were the forced laborers or the sharecroppers or the convict leasers, and Indigenous people were the pushed out west, we had no chance to participate in that wealth. Not only was it done at our expense, but even if white America secretly did something over there, there was no chance for us to be equal participants in that wealth. And the moment that we did have a chance to, and Reconstruction was that chance, the country turned its back on Reconstruction, decided it was not worth even a decade of time. And so we gave centuries to the institution of slavery, to the systematic land theft of Indigenous tribes' land. And then when Black people did finally, on our own, pull our bootstraps up, do what everyone told us to do, and get our own land, in 1910, Black land ownership peaked. And then it was like white supremacists said, how dare they? How dare you do what we told you to do? How dare you pick yourself up by your bootstraps and build wealth for yourself? How dare you have a Black Wall Street in Tulsa? How dare you have a Black Wall Street in Wilmington? How dare you have these hubs and centers and enclaves where Black people are doctors and lawyers? And it just spurred so much ire and hatred in white people who could not stand to see Black people doing as well, if not better than them, with all of the cards stacked against them. And that is where we get all of these modern problems that we have now. Because if we had done, if it had ended at chattel slavery and we had actually gone about a process of Reconstruction, then we would be having a very different conversation today. But because we didn't, the problem compounded and worsened. People who did have land had it taken from them through eminent domain, through mob violence, through heirs property and property law, USDA discrimination. And all of these different tactics have led us into a world where Black people have less land now than we did in 1910. Where in my family, we have gone back as far as what equity looks like in our family. And so that was an important thing for me to really materialize, and that though in some ways we have come a very long way, me sitting on this stage, having this conversation, getting to publish a book like this is the proof that we've come a long way. And my family had more wealth 100 years ago than we do now. And that is also a fact. And many Black American families can say that. They say, oh, my family used to have some land in Mississippi. Oh, my family used to have some land in Louisiana. And that used to is is much more passive and like lets people off the hook. And what I hope that the book does is puts those people back on the hook and says, well, the land did not vanish. Like we talk about the Great Migration and we're like, oh yeah, Black people fled north. And it's like, but they couldn't put their land in their suitcase. And the land is still here somewhere. So who owns it? Who has those deeds? Why do they have those deeds? How did they get those deeds? And how can we redistribute that land? So I want people to, the book does a better job of doing this.
No,
But,
this is great.
but I do want people to see that when we talk about things like food insecurity, land theft is the source of that. When we talk about racial wealth gaps, land is the source of that. And it actually frustrates me when we talk about things like pay equity, when it's like, I can never outwork an endowment or a trust fund that someone else inherited. I'll never outwork that because while I'm working, theirs is gaining interest. So I have to keep outworking the interest that they're accruing at my expense. And so it's really important that we see this. Housing insecurity, gentrification, all of these are byproducts. And we have to look at that 20th century period, and specifically the Great Migration, as a period where Black people were forced north and their wealth remained in the South in the hands of other people.
You spatialize this problem really beautifully in your discussion of the horrors of Wilmington and Tulsa, which I confess, much as I thought I knew about Tulsa, especially less so about Wilmington, I thought of in terms of attacks on people, on the Black community, in terms of massacres and an exodus that was forced and the loss of their community, but you spatialize it in terms of the loss of their space, this place. You recenter that understanding of the story to property and the land that their homes and communities sat on. And that was a fresh way of grasping it for me. You went back and visited many of the sites of these vanished or disappeared communities, and you're walking into empty space, into a landscape of absence. What was that like for you?
Yeah, Wilmington was the hardest to
Yeah.
visit in that way. Tulsa, Oklahoma too, but Tulsa has done a great job of making people remember what happened. Now they are really bad at taking accountability for the thing that happened. They're like, this happened, but no one should pay the price for it. There are living survivors of the Tulsa massacre who still go in and out of courtrooms to tell the stories of what happened to them when they were children, not descendants. Like, these are people who saw this violence.
Yeah.
And when you think of them, it's hard not to think of space and of the absence, because then you think of what they had and that they were then displaced all over the country, that a beautifully intact, vibrant community was dispersed violently, and that there are descendants who had to start over and don't have that connection to that place. And I have to credit Isabel Wilkerson, because she did a lot of great work in The Warmth of Other Suns of getting people to think of those who traveled during the Great Migration as domestic refugees. And I think that moments like the Wilmington and Tulsa massacres really paint that picture. So for those who don't know much about Wilmington, because I think Tulsa takes up a bit more space in like the mainstream, but Wilmington, North Carolina, actually that massacre happened 23 years before the Tulsa massacre. And it was the blueprint that was used for the Atlanta massacre that happened in 1906, and then for the Tulsa massacre that happened in 1921. And the Wilmington massacre is also, the one time I have seen it brought up is actually after January 6th. A lot of people made draws to it because the Wilmington massacre was also a coup. And so in Wilmington, you had this thriving multiracial community, but where Black people were actually almost on top socioeconomically. You had Black people who were mortgage lenders, so there were white residents in town who were in debt to a Black lender. You had a Black-owned resort, Seabreeze Resort and Freeman's Beach. You had all sorts of businesses, and it was such a thriving community. And then things got really bad because North Carolina was also one of those states in the South where, when Reconstruction was beginning, North Carolina was the home of some of the first Black elected officials. And so you'll see, like, technically, a lot of the first Black elected officials were elected in like the 1890s, and then the next one wasn't until the 60s. And a lot of those that were elected in the 1890s were elected in North Carolina in places like Wilmington. And so in this season, this biracial legislature gets elected in Wilmington, and just like white supremacists just cannot have it. And they start with oration, and there's these really violent, hateful speeches about Black men who are harming white women, who are a threat to white families and white womanhood, and when are white men gonna stand up and protect their vulnerable community members? And so it starts with the speeches, and then newspapers are circulating the speeches, and so this is like their version of it going viral, right?
Which she tracks beautifully in your
you.
section on Wilmington.
Thank you, because I think it's important to say that the massacres don't, it's like, I think the massacres are painted as like, these mobs just did it out of nowhere. And it's these mobs got a lot of permission from white elites. And not even just permission, the mobs were all but like demanded to do this. And in Wilmington especially, you know, so it starts with the speeches are circulated, elected officials are like, you know, keep them away from the polls no matter what. And so white people are like, cool. I heard no matter what, by any means necessary. That means by any means necessary. In the weeks leading up to the election, local businesses refused to sell gunpowder or ammunition or weapons of any kind to Black people, and white families were hoarding them. And then on the day of this election, when this biracial commission is supposed to be reelected, obviously they are not reelected because Black people stay away from the polls and are intimidated away from the polls. And when this new legislature gets elected, it's like, now it's time for the massacre. Now we have immunity because the people in office are going to make sure that nothing happens to those of us who enact the violence. And literally, you have mobs standing at all of the exits of the town with these like cannons and their version of machine guns. And then mobs are going house by house, telling Black families to leave. But as the families are trying to flee out of the exits, the exits are blocked and they're being gunned down. The only survivors of the Wilmington massacre were those who hid out in cemeteries and nearby swamps.
And in Friends, was this an event where wealthier Black people were taking some people in to their homes?
Yes, and that was happening. And it was a lot of Black clergy, yes, and wealthier Black people. Some of them in this instance were actually given warning and were kind of told, like, we like you. Be out of sight on this day when this happens. And they took those warnings and they were out of sight and they were silent. And those are also some of the survivors who do talk about that. And you know, there's other things we could talk about, self-preservation, but I'm not gonna blame people who are staring down their deaths for how they survived. But very few people did survive. And literally as Black families are being gunned down, forced out of their homes, white families, amidst the gunfire, are moving into the homes, are going down to the courthouse, burning deeds so that there can be no paper trail of who used to own what house. And these are things that these survivors recall and are saying, yeah, so-and-so used to live in that house, and then there's no proof though now that they used to live there. And so-and-so used to, and these survivors were documenting, I mean, this is so well documented, this massacre. Too well documented, which also shows sort of the audacity of the moment, because those who were enacting the violence had called journalists, were posing in front of the homes that they were taking, were posing in front of the Black-owned newspaper that they had burned to the ground. Like, they were very proud of what they did. So much so that nearby politicians after the success were like, teach us how to do that in Atlanta. And then 7 years later, they did that in Atlanta. And then they said, oh my gosh, it worked in Atlanta. Teach us how to do that in Tulsa. And they taught them how to do that in Tulsa. And it's just, when you see that, when you see how meticulous it was, it's frustrating to hear people say, we wouldn't even know where to start with reparations. Because I'm like, start with the descendants of those survivors. You don't have to start with every single just, like I think we can start with a very narrow, where are the descendants or survivors of these massacres? Because there is a home they should have inherited, or they should have been able to sell that home on their own volition, on their own time, on their own pace. And the fact that so many Black families have had to start over with nothing but the clothes on their backs, and that their government has done nothing in the face of that but tell them, keep up the good work for starting over and over again. And like those are the early 20th century. But even during the process of this book tour, eminent domain came up a lot. And I was in Detroit on the book tour, and an older Black woman described how when she was a teenager, an area in Detroit was cleared out through eminent domain. Her uncle owned 3 properties in that community. He had saved his entire life and built up two of them were businesses, one was a family home for the family. All 3 properties were taken through eminent domain. He got $0 and 0 cents for the 3 properties he'd saved his whole life for. What do you tell someone who puts their life savings into businesses and properties that the government says, I need that? And then he is forced to start over as a renter somewhere else. And that is someone who we expect to live in our society. He's not supposed to be angry. He's not allowed to be mad at the world. He's supposed to be a regular citizen, and he's not supposed to carry a chip on his shoulder. And that's what so many Black people, that's what we do to Black people in this country. We force them into, but the powers that be force Black and Indigenous people into these corners, and then are then mad at us when we are mad, and then vilify our righteous anger. And so that's why I genuinely believe that reparations is a solution to racial wealth gaps, is a solution to a lot of environmental harms, but it's also a solution to a lot of the division that we're in. I think there are a lot of white people who have no idea how angry the average Black person is, how much we are holding, how much we've had to eat, how much our elders are holding, how much they don't talk about. Even in the process of this book, getting some of my elders to admit things that happened to them that they have just been carrying so much shame about, that are not their fault. And getting to tell them, like, don't blame yourself. This is systematic. You did not do anything to deserve this happening to you. You were not careless, you were not dumb, you were not, whatever the things are. You just were you were a victim of this very, very predatory system. And if we want unity and post-racial America, like, it's not going to happen with so much righteous anger held up here and so much nonchalance in white America. There has to be the same level of urgency that says, I see your blood boiling, and my blood is boiling too. And to calm the boiling, we have to turn down the heat. That has to happen.
I have a question. We talked earlier upstairs about how our sights for the book and our goals changed in the process of writing it, expanded and enlarged. We're amplified. Now that it's out, and it was years in the making, I'm sure, is there anything you wish you'd done differently that you failed to include that now you wish was in there? Is there some regret, or are you pretty glad where it landed? Do you feel like you got everything nailed
Definitely,
down?
I don't know an author who thinks they got everything.
Yeah.
I definitely, there's always, like, I have a whole Google Doc of things that I'm like, this could have been there, and this could have been, this could have been a much thicker book. I think the one piece that I wish I had more time to really give more space to was the role of Black women's relationship to land. I tried my best to do that, especially within my own family, but it requires a lot of creativity because the archive just erases us so much.
It does.
Like
completely.
in my family, I know based on oral history, like our family oral tradition will say, Lewis and Nancy bought 350 acres. But the deed on record says Lewis plus wife bought 350 acres. It won't even say her name.
Yeah.
So if I did not know her name, I would never know. Yeah. Like I would not literally know. I'd have to just be like, oh, Lewis's wife helped, maybe, or maybe she's just their name. And I know more about the details of the roles of the women in my life and the elder women in my life because of oral history, but I wish I had time to corroborate that with the archive and to show more examples of it.
I think you should give yourself more credit. You have a number of women in the book. You do really right by a woman named Queen something.
Well, yes.
That's a beautiful section. And the one on the woman who was, she was the head of a brothel and a terrific land buyer, a shrewd businesswoman, and Lucy. Trans, right?
Yes.
And was very much punished for that. That's a gorgeous section. The stuff in your family. Frankly, one of the things that makes the book such a good read is that you move from your reporting to your deep analysis of archival records, to your personal story and your examination of your own family history, and you keep it mixed. It's a really mixed brew. It's not one thing, and that leavens the whole effect, which is really welcome. It keeps it diverse, a diverse reading experience. I wondered as I was reading it, I was finding anecdotes and stories that really compelled me. Did you have one or two? We don't have much time left, but you want to share where you felt like you hit pay dirt when you got this story, when you found this source, that this was, this story, you didn't even see it coming and it just nailed it. Was there something
There were actually,
like that?
there's actually two of those. There were, because the book it does cover some really hard parts of history, I wanted to find joy or just like examples of things gone right. And one of those examples was actually one of the only times that the Department of Justice has ever done anything really right by Black people. And I had never heard this, which is that the Department of Justice at one point was prosecuting the KKK. And when I say prosecuting the KKK, I mean they were rounding up, they were going through the South, county by county, arresting and like bringing forward real charges. And all of it was one of the first times that white people were being held accountable for harms that they had done to Black people. Like their victims were all Black people, and that was enough for the Department of Justice. And it was just really fascinating to find that part of history, because I was also able to find the court transcripts. And the transcripts were mind-blowing. Number one, because you just see why some of these things didn't, like, I'm just like, oh, well, where did it go? And how many people did they get? And then you're like, oh man, it didn't go as well as it could have, but the transcripts are so revealing. Number one, because a lot of wealthy elites, especially like sitting senators, were testifying on behalf of KKK members. Their version of GoFundMe's, like they were crowdsourcing to pay for KKK members' legal defense. They were like raising tens of thousands of dollars for legal defense for these KKK members. Legislators were calling in favors to get people out of their charges, and it just became too much. And then ultimately at one point, and this is where Black and Indigenous history convene, is that the Attorney General at the time, his name was Amos Ackerman.
My favorite character, or one of them in the whole
He
book.
wasn't, because he was
that.
a white man who was just very randomly passionate about prosecuting the KKK.
Yeah.
And
really good at it.
And he was really good at it, but his problem was that he was also passionate about prosecuting railroad tycoons.
Yeah.
And the railroad tycoons were like, I'm not having that. They're getting in the way of my ability to take land, because I need land to lay railroad tracks. And if this Attorney General is overzealous and not letting me steal Indigenous land and lay these tracks, then he's getting in my way. And so they literally started lobbying to get the Attorney General out. And KKK members and their allies were also lobbying, and it was too much pressure. And the sitting president at the time, Grant, said, okay, cool. We'll take him down. He's got to go, and replace that Attorney General. And the cases died with him. But it was beautiful to see it at one point, because I think it showed that the idea that it has never been attempted, that there's no path, is a lie. There are so many agencies that just don't use their resources the way they could. And this was a moment in time where an agency tried to do the right thing and lobbyists got in the way. But like, what if that's what the DOJ did? What if the DOJ was actually a Department of Justice and actually pursued justice for the most marginalized? And that was a moment when it actually lived up to that reputation. And then the other cool fact was just that right after emancipation, Black women were actually buying land more than their husbands, and often had to go through their husbands because of patriarchy at the time. And the reason that Black women were more positioned was because Black women had more disposable income and more employment opportunities just after the Civil War. A lot of Black men were being ensnared as sharecroppers or convict leasers, but Black women were being hired by Confederate widows who could not keep their homes, had never had to keep their homes, always had estates and teams of enslaved people who did that work for them. And all of a sudden they had no husbands. Their husbands were off fighting in wars or had been killed in the war. They had no their husbands left. And so as a result, they had no overseers, and it was just, they could not keep home. And so they would hire these Black women to cook and clean for them. And it got to a point where the Confederate widows were paying the Black women in their clothing and in their jewelry and in their property because they didn't have actual cash. And then the Confederate widows were mad because the Black women who were working for them were in town in their dresses and were buying land with their money. But it was a key path to Black women's economic mobility, and it was really interesting to see that that was a thing. And I, after learning that, was able to retrace some steps because I'm like, wait a second, that actually makes sense because my great-great-great-grandparents bought their land from a white woman. Mm-hmm. Her name was Rebecca, and she lived in Norfolk, Virginia. And I still don't know the actual story of that, but I imagine she may have been a Confederate widow with very few other options, but to sell her land to Black people who were some of the only people who wanted to buy land in the former Confederacy. And so that was an interesting thing, that Black women just had lots of disposable income and fabulous dresses and books that they sometimes couldn't even read, but that's what they were being paid with.
Yeah. Well, that's probably the story we should end on. But I've got 2 minutes, and I just want to say one of the things I admire about the book is you do not surrender to Afro-pessimism. You are an optimist throughout, though a fierce one, an angry one, and that isn't compromised either. And it's clear in this book, as it is in mine, I think, that there's no certainty of progress. There's no guarantee that there's improvement. Things get worse. Things can get really worse in a hurry, and gains and advances we take for granted can crumble at an election, as we all know. And it's a cautionary story too. Yeah. What happens in the 20th century, halfway through and beyond, is a chilling saga of Black land loss. And the reasons you give for it and their root in government policy that penalizes Black landowners and would-be farmers is chilling. And there's a story for us there to heed as well. And I'm so glad you don't sugarcoat that.
Thank you.
Pretend it's better than it is.
Right.
It's always on the edge.
Yeah.
So.
Especially with our last minute before we go to questions, but I think especially what was revealing was seeing what had happened to Black and Indigenous people on this land, and seeing that happen to immigrant communities of color now, and feeling as though what was perfected against us is now being weaponized against so many others. Yeah. And so to me, it's not just say, wow, what happened in the past is so bad. It's that what happened in the past is happening right now to Chicano farm workers in California, to Marshallese farm workers in Arkansas, to API farm workers in Georgia, is that we want people to work the land without being able to benefit from their work. We want people to work the land without ever being able to own it. And that always produces inequality. That always produces bad outcomes, not just for us, but also for the people doing the stealing. And I think we're seeing now what our interdependency really looks like. That if you hoard the land and it strips the soil and it leaves our water poisoned and it leaves, and you don't listen to Indigenous wisdom when they say to do controlled burns and to do X, Y, and Z and to do crop covers, then it's gonna affect all of us. And white people are trying to colonize Mars instead of do right by the land here. And if we can redistribute that land to the original stewards, we don't need to find a new planet to try and grow things on. We can rehabilitate the one that we have here and follow the leadership of those who have always treated that land in that reciprocal way. So thank y'all for being here.
Well, I'm jealous of this Q&A because I have enough questions to keep us going, but I think we need to open it up to the folks out there. Who will I be? Do you want to call on people who are asking questions? Yes. Go for it. Yeah.
Hi, Brea. Just first, thank you so much for writing this book. It is so important and deeply personal. So just grateful for how you did so much research personally in your own family. It is truly inspiring, I think, for me especially. As I think about my spirit and my call internally for wanting ease in my life and wanting to create that for my family, friends, community. My question is, what do you think the spiritual lesson is for millennials and Gen Z as you yourself as a landowner who is touching the grass every day and like feeding your chickens and has your son running around? Like, what do you think the spiritual lesson and call is for us?
Thank you for that question. That's my son's godmother, y'all. So, but truly, like I love that question because we didn't get to dig into it just now, but I do talk in the book a lot about how the lesson I learned in writing the book was that we all try to outsmart the land and outsmart nature too much. And it always comes back to bite us. Like we never actually do it. We think that we can grow things faster and bigger and better, and it always hurts us in the end. And so land and this research has helped me to realize that slowing down is a form of activism. And these things can sound like, just cliches or like, fun little metaphors, but I mean that in a very literal sense, that everything capitalism tells us is go faster, produce more in less time with less resources at more of a profit margin. And sometimes the answer is to scale down, is to say, wait, we're doing too much. And we have enough technology and we have enough surplus that this should have made our quality of life better. But it hasn't. We're still working all the time and it's not sustainable. And I think the land and nature is a really good teacher in what is not sustainable for the land is also not sustainable for us. And I think that's why I think of chattel slavery and land theft as so intertwined, is number one, because the demand for one fed the demand for other. If they didn't have enslaved people to work all of the land, they would have stopped taking it. And if they didn't have land for all of the enslaved people to work, they wouldn't have been stealing us. So they go hand in hand. But in the same time that they're like whipping Black people into working at a pace that's unsustainable, they're whipping the land into yielding at a pace that is unsustainable. Mm-hmm. And just thinking about how much that has done so much harm on the food we ingest. And I think the pandemic was a moment and is still a moment where people are realizing that we are a lot more dependent on our food and basic needs being shipped into us, when it doesn't need to be that way. If we had more small local farmers who were providing most of our food, and that's where most of us got our food from, we might not be in such precarious situations when these times come. But we are, because in North Carolina, all of the farmers are being told to grow the same 3 crops, right? Soybeans, tobacco, and cotton. And you can't eat soybean, tobaccos, and cotton when you can't ship in other things. And that is something that the USDA incentivized. So I think that's part of why it's the spiritual element is so tied to the policy, because we are only at this pace because someone told us to. Someone said faster is better, and we said yes. And now we're all moving a mile a minute, and we don't have time to look at the stars and breathe in fresh air and sit in some water and all of the things. And this was after the book was written, but one of those moments where this really internalized was actually the last eclipse. And I remember everyone just stopping what they were doing, finding some glasses and looking out in the sky. And I was just like, we should do this more. This was nice. This was really beautiful. And why don't we have time for that? And that's what I love about being so close to land. It forces you to remember that. When you're living in a densely populated space and you stay in your apartment on Zoom all day, it's easy to believe that everything is an emergency. But when you live on land and your chickens are as long as you feed me and give me water once a day, I'm good. You're just what else can be, what is really that hard? I mean, some of y'all do important work. Some of y'all are doctors and stuff like that. But the rest, if you get on Zoom to do your job, it's probably not that urgent, right? It's probably not. And we just move at a pace that is just unrealistic, unsustainable, and just not warranted. And I think land just reminds us to just sit and be still and go slower. And that has been so spiritually rejuvenating. In addition, it's also why I believe that reparations would support Black people, not just economically, but I think that a lot of the trauma and pain and jitteriness and shattered nervous systems that Black people are moving through the world with would really find a center with more access to land. But if your access to land is your fire escape and a park, that's not enough to force you to slow down and to be well. We don't get enough exposure.
We should see who else has a question here. There's someone. This woman over here? Yeah.
Thank you. Hello, I'm Iris, and Brea, I really like what you said towards the end about we're sort of seeing the same thing with our immigrant communities. So I'm a climate journalist, and I'm working on a story about H2A and the it's an agricultural guest worker program about farm workers in Washington. And so they come, they work, treated very badly, paid very little, those types of things. So I was just thinking about that and the connections in your book. But one thing that I was, thinking about too is I've been sort of on my Afrofuturism kick, reading all the Butler and Kay Jemison, all that types of stuff. So I was wondering if any like themes of like mysticism or anything like that showed up in your work when you're doing archival research or talking to your family members and just interviewing folks.
Quoter.
Thanks.
Ooh, yeah, I was about to say, I love me some Octavia Butler. And I also just reread The Parable of the Sower because it starts in 2024. And I mean, do it, but don't do it, but do it. It's tough to read and be like, it's not this bad, but is it almost this bad? But yes, the mysticism. So actually, someone whose book I love that talks about this, Trisha Hersey, who some of y'all might know as the Nat Bishop or the Nat Ministry, she wrote a book, Rest is Resistance, and she talks about this in the context of Harriet Tubman and how Harriet Tubman was a disabled woman, of course, who was freeing people, and people just like could not understand how she was traveling back into the South without being caught. And there was this idea of like, is she like teleporting? Is she like it would? People really thought it was like mystical in that sense. And I like the idea of that, but I honestly think that the more powerful truth is that the mysticism is Black people's ingenuity. But I think that the mysticism I'm interested in is the land being almost like our comrade. Like I believe that. I believe the land is conspiring with us for our freedom. And I think that there have been so many moments in history where a Black person was freeing themselves, right? Whether they were a maroon or a fugitive who was fleeing to Canada or Mexico. And it just felt like the literal stars were aligning for their path to freedom, right? Like they did it on foot and somehow fed themselves and somehow stayed hidden, even with dogs like on their backs. And like, I have to believe that nature and the land had to be literally covering their tracks in some way. And that might feel mystical to some people. That might just be, some people might just be like, oh, they just happened to escape on this kind of day. But like, I do think that is a part of our traditions. I mean, New Year's was an example of that. And on enslaved plantations, a lot of Black people would flee on New Year's. And there was a practical sense, which is like everyone's too busy celebrating and you can get away faster. But there was also this idea that like there was something about New Year's that was like cosmic and like was a like auspicious day to flee. And I don't know. I like the idea of that. I'm someone who, to this day, I have an altar. I talk to my ancestors. I believe that my ancestors are guiding me. Throughout this book, I felt like my grandfather would like put research in my path. And I'm like, I would not have found that. Like, why? How did I happen upon that? Or I'd be traveling in Wilmington and randomly stop someone and ask them something, and they happen to be a descendant of a survivor. And I'm just having the most beautiful conversation in a way that I'm just like, I don't believe in coincidences. So I think the mysticism is beautiful. And I think that's a bit of where my Afro-optimism comes from. That I think pessimism makes sense for a season, but it's just not historically what has gotten my people to the places that we've gotten to. That optimism and belief in self and ingenuity has always been, the maker of differences. And whether you're believing in a creator or a energy power that is making that happen, or whether, again, you just happened to flee on a really good day where the weather was going to erase your paths and hide your scent, or you ended up in a swamp or whatever, but I believe that. And I think look into the Great Dismal Swamp if you haven't already. You're a climate journalist, so you might have, but the Great Dismal Swamp in North Carolina has a lot of mystical things around it because so many maroon communities of enslaved Black people and indigenous community were hiding out there, like miles away from plantations, and were not being found. And there was this idea that like, oh, maybe there's some mystical thing that's like hiding the entrance to the swamp or something, but maybe they were just creative and found a way. But either way, whatever we tell ourselves, it happened.
Any other questions? Good.
Hi, my name is Jody. Thank you so much for being here and for writing this book. As I think somebody that studied estates and real estate and property and is in the work of land justice now, it's been a really interesting read, and really important, I think, to see how not only you and your family have thought about land and how you continuing to hold your grandfather and your grandparents' legacy through land, but also just like how you think about land justice as repair. And the chapter on repair was particularly interesting to me because I think about this a lot. One thing, I think right now we're sitting in this moment where even in California, the committee that was stood up to actually research and put forth recommendations for what reparations could look like in the state of California has been stymied by the Black folks that I think were leading it to some degree, and the Governor Newsom. So there are lots of examples of like top down reparations and what that could look like that date back even to like General Sherman and 40 Acres and the Mule. I'm guessing, like, I guess my question is, like, what are some inspirational examples of ground up reparations that you've been seeing locally? You don't have to name
Yeah.
specific people or organizations, but I'm just curious, like, how are people trading land? How are they thinking about mutual aid as it relates to land in the South these
Yeah.
days?
Yeah, 1,000,000%. I mean, I will shout out some organizations and people because I think there's some spaces doing some really cool things. But yeah, I agree with you. Like the top down piece, I think it's always going to be diluted. And I'm at a place where I see reparations as inevitable. And I think the powers that be do as well. And I think they're now trying to really control what reparations will look like because it's sort of like, well, if it's going to happen, let's make sure it's the bare minimum, you know? And so I think we have to be in charge of keeping it imaginative and keeping it abundant. So number one is conservation groups are actually on the front line of doing a lot of land reclamation work.
Absolutely.
I think it's a really interesting and exciting path because they're doing it through nonprofits, which is great. And a lot of them, what I'm seeing is that conservationist groups or land trusts they normally would buy land at market value and just keep the land holdings so that it doesn't go to a developer, right? Like that's how those conservationist groups go. Like let's just hold land so that it can sit here and rewild and just be land and not be done. But a lot of those conservationist groups are white led, and they also have their own rules about what can and cannot happen on that land. And sometimes in their conservationist fervor, they go so far and it can like lean into like a bit of anti-indigeneity. And so a lot of these conservationist groups are deeding that land directly to tribes and to Black families. I'm seeing this especially in the Pacific Northwest. I see it a lot in Washington and California where forested areas are just being, they're already being held as forests and they're being deeded back to the tribes that ancestrally held them, and it's really beautiful. Or there are these like cultural easement agreements, which I talk about in the book, where a person who says, I own this land, but I want to make sure that anyone with ancestral ties to this land knows they have access to it. So maybe we are a public park, but we're going to make sure that if an indigenous person wants to come here and fish, they can. Now, like a regular person coming in cannot fish on this land, but an indigenous person could because that's what the cultural easement allows for. And so those are some really creative things that I'm seeing being done in climate spaces, which I think is a great approach because it's treating land reclamation as a climate justice policy. And there's a lot of money in climate justice. And I don't think it needs to all go to Silicon Valley. I think these are really great strategies. So that's one that I think is cool. And there's a group in North Carolina that's doing similar things called Triangle Land Conservancy. So showing them some love. I gotta show love to the people in the room. Where's My Land? Where's My Land is also doing this in a really beautiful way without waiting on the federal government to do it. They are tracing cases of eminent domain and just wrongful land seizures and providing a research and advocacy support to the families so that those families can advocate for reversals of those seizures. And they were successful in the case of Bruce's Beach in California, where the Bruces got their family land back. Now, Where's My Land is doing important work. And after the success of Bruce's Beach, they got so many inquiries from other Black families that they had to close down their form because they literally like, we cannot do all of the research for all of these families. But to me, the work of an organization like Where's My Land should be scaled so that they could research as many instances of land theft as possible, so that, because this is a hyper-local thing. If they can prove that a local government took the land through eminent domain and either that land is not being used for the purposes they said they were gonna take it for, it's still sitting vacant, or it's just, whatever the case may be, like, return it. It is as simple as returning it. It doesn't require evicting anyone from their current home. A lot of this land is still just sitting there and it can be returned. And I think that what Where's My Land is doing is really, really important, because a lot of times people are sort of like, oh, well, you're just gonna take private property. And it's like, there's a lot of private property that's just sitting there doing absolutely nothing but collecting private property taxes. So that's another group that I think is really doing amazing work. And if local governments would take it upon themselves to just say, hey, we know we took people's land through eminent domain. We're not going to put the burden of proof on you. We're going to proactively say, here's some of that land back and how can we return it, or at least give you the monetary amount that you should have had for it. So I think that those are two ground up policies that I love. And then a last one that is not quite reparations, but is a really beautiful land reclamation project is a nonprofit called Growing Change. There are abandoned jails and prisons all around the country. And sometimes that is just because they built a bigger prison and moved the population in and just left the other one stranded. And so it's just sitting there, and they're just blights on the community. They're often in rural communities and taking up space. And this organization found an agreement with the state of North Carolina to lease those empty prisons for free and to turn them into community gardens. And they use the land to grow food. They've been able to grow so much food that they're able to ship surplus food to other people in cities elsewhere. I think it's such a beautiful model, and this idea of reclaiming space and that spatiality piece, that like a site that was formerly a site of oppression can be a site of joy and literal like growth and greenness and food. And I think that's a really beautiful concept that they are reclaiming those sites. So I think it's also what the advocacy of Cop City is, right? Is like, hey, this does not have to continue to be a site of oppression. We can do something more beautiful with it. And we all have spaces in our communities that are blights that could be used in better ways. And just starting with those land reclamation projects and making sure Black and Indigenous people get to be at the forefront and helm of them can be really great places to start.
I'd add to that my book concerns an effort to start a Black farm colony before the Civil War in the Adirondack region. Conservation groups today are interested in the descendants of those Black farmers who got 3,000 people got land in the Adirondacks to farm. Not many of them came to do it, but some did. And one of them, the Adirondack Land Trust, now insists on doing due diligence searches of the background of the owners of deeds to ensure that if there was some Indigenous family that owned land, or one of the Black families that got land from the abolitionist Garrett Smith, they will want to track that down. They want to note that in their research. They want to make something of that, possibly contact that family and arrange some connection to it. They just bought a big piece of land for an Indigenous cultural group that has a museum in the Adirondacks. This is something land trusts were not doing even 10 years ago. So this is pioneering work.
Right, and you don't have to wait for, like, the beautiful thing is they have so much autonomy. As long as their boards are on board, they can do whatever they want and they can dispatch the resources. And actually, as you said that, some plantations are doing that too, that due diligence research.
Oh, interesting.
There's one historic Stagville, which is just outside of like the Durham area in North Carolina, where they've been doing due diligence research on the descendants of formerly enslaved people from that plantation. And they open up the space for those descendants for whatever purposes they want to use it for. So the descendants host their family reunions at the former plantation where their ancestors were enslaved. And the plantation, which otherwise does tours and whatnot, shuts down for them and says, for this week, his Stagville is closed and only descendants can access the grounds and they can do whatever they want. They're the only ones who are allowed inside of the former cabins for enslaved people, et cetera. And this idea that those who are descendants of the harm should have the most access to the site and to the information is important. And I think there's a lot of people who have really important archival information, and if you do the due diligence, if you track the deed, if you track the names on whatever, if you've got an old Bible and it's got name, like there's a lot of that we can return.
And her section on Stagville is a really good read. That's a really great piece of storytelling in
Thank
that
you
book.
so much.
I'd like to go there. I'd like
Yes,
to hear
no, you
that
have
guy
to.
give that tour.
It was one of the best places I've visited because I've never done a plantation tour before, and I was at a Black-owned farm in Durham, and someone was like, "You should go to Stagville," and I'm like, "Go to the plantation?"
Yeah.
I was like, "Okay, for research," and then I get there and I was like, "Wow, this is the most like decolonialist, anti-racist like tour I'd ever seen." I imagine it's very similar to what's being done kind of at the Whitney Plantation, and to know that the people directing those sites are really thinking of ways to account for and repair the harm.
Some of those sites.
Some of them, and
Yeah.
more of them can though. More people can, like the idea that reparations is something that's like, oh, that's Biden's job. It's like, no, we have jobs, and whether you work in a legacy media publication like the New York Times, who had a role in spreading the rumors that created Central Park, because Central Park was once a Black Seneca village. Like the New York Times was very complicit in how it transitioned and changed hands. So people working there can, like, I just think there's ways for each of us in whatever industry you work in to find out how land is tied to it and find your path. If you're an educator at a school, your school is on land. Where'd you get the land from, right? Like if you're at a university or a college, probably from indigenous stolen land. So I just think that land affects so many more of us than we think. If you eat, if you have a brick and mortar building of any kind, land is responsible for those things.
I think we have time for one more question.
Okay.
Is there someone who has one? Because if you don't, I'm going to take it. Oh, good, you got
They
it.
do.
Thank you for being here today. Two things really. What is your work, your view when it comes to gentrification? Do you view it as the same as far as land theft, like recolonizing and such forth? And the next thing I'd say is, do you see, and this can be for both of you because both of your works are so heavily rooted in land, do you see white people at any point stopping the practice of racism? And if not, what steps do we take?
Mm-hmm. So, that's a tough last one. So can you remind me the first question that you asked?
That's gentrification.
Yes, gentrification. Okay, yes. I do see that as very similar, but I don't think that it has to be that way. There's a cool shirt that I bought that says regeneration, not gentrification. And I love that shirt because it reminds me that migration does not have to inherently be violent and extractive. Gentrification is. Colonialism is. But like moving cities is not inherently like oppressive thing to do. It's how we move cities and how we move spaces that makes the big difference. And I think when we move into a space as if we are entitled to it, it should be ours, we get to to shift what community looks like in that space, I think that's different. So for example, as a former New Yorker who now lives in Georgia, I've been very mindful of the fact that there are a lot of New Yorkers and Los Angelinos and Chicagoans who are moving to the South in cities like Atlanta and Raleigh and Houston, and it's changing those cities. And if I move the way that people move to New York, I will be gentrifying Atlantans out of their city the way that I was gentrified out of my home state. And I don't want to do that. And so there are some things that are less out of my control, like my home value has gone up, whether I want it to or not, but how I relate to my community members, how I relate to local politics, how I stand up for locals and say like, hey, don't do anything in my name that would hurt people who were here before me, is how we insist that it doesn't become gentrification. So when people move into Brooklyn and dictate how bodegas are run and dictates how families use their stoops and dictate what public space looks like and bring in more policing and bring in businesses that also do more policing, like that is gentrification. But moving and bringing in a local business that provides local jobs, or moving and being someone who looks out for your neighbors and who spends your money with local, like that is a beautiful thing. So I think I'm very mindful of the fact that not everything has to inherently be violent, but we also can't be cavalier and just hope that our intentions will be enough. And to that point, I think there are some white people who have really taken up that role of I have to take an active role. Like, it is not Black people's job to fix white supremacy, but we have oftentimes it is Black people who are the frontline folks. But that doesn't mean that across history there have never been times where white Americans have stood up and said, I don't want it to look like this. There's some really beautiful stories of multiracial union work that I talk about in the book. There's some really beautiful stories of white landowners using and leveraging their land for things like the Underground Railroad, for things like domestic refugees of the Great Migration and of mob violence, of white people who signed on as like co-signers and would bridge gaps that they knew the Black people and Indigenous people around them could not bridge on their own. And I think that the more we can do that, the more we can embrace it. But I've talked about this before. I think right now we're in this place where more people feel ashamed of the past than excited about addressing it. And I think we've got to just shift that. Like, if your shame keeps you avoidant, it's not helping anybody. Like, you just being in your apartment guilty is not helping anyone. But if you can do something with that guilt and say, actually, the guilt is not mine, in a sense, it's that people before me who look like me did something, and again, I'm not gonna let them do it in my name. I'm gonna say not on my watch, then we get to do something different. But if we allow it to go on and say, hey, that was before me, like, that's somebody else's problem, then you're reclining on the ease that violence made possible for you.
Beautiful.
And that is not something that we can tolerate. So we have to get up out of the chairs and say, no, I can't rest if they're not resting. If Black people's blood is boiling, if Indigenous people's blood is boiling, if there are racist mascots still, if Ivy League universities still have Indigenous artifacts, if Black people are still paying more in property taxes, though we own less of the land, that's a problem, and it should be all of our problem.
I can't think of a better conclusion to this. Can you? That was beautiful. Thank you so much. It was beautiful.
Thank you all so much, and for this gorgeous conversation. Thank you all. Stay, have conversation, grab a drink at the bar, and then also with Brea's book, we're going to do a personalization line on the other side of this wall. So just line up here in the auditorium, and we'll get her all set up, and then you can greet her and thank her for her fabulous work. And again, thank you all so much for this conversation.
Thank you for having me. Thank you so much.
Bye.